Alright, so we're familiar with the sort of subgenre horror, the home invasion movie, but now I think I want to talk about two movies that kind of take home invasion in a bit of a different, more intrusive even direction, with two movies that are quite different in their approach and their execution, yet somehow have always reminded me of each other in regards to how it approaches a sort of home invasion, if you will. We did talk about Pacific Heights earlier this year, I think over the summer, when I did that video with my brother on our favorite villains, and Carter Hayes, the Keaton character in this, was on my brother's list. So that seems like a good jumping off point, and then we will get into a an Australian TV movie by Peter Weir. Before Peter Weir had done like Pitting Hanging Rock, I think by then, and one or two others. The Last Wave might predate it as well. It went in a very as far as looking at Weir's filmography, in a very unexpected direction, before or after. So I definitely want to go into that also. And it's another movie where, like how we talked about Teeth, a movie that seems practically impossible to find a physical copy of, so I do have representation for Pacific Heights. But The Plumber is around in certain places if you like really, really look for it. Which is another reason that I kind of can't wait to talk about it. So, and we will be talking about it in full depth, so if you're worried about this movie hardly anybody has seen or even knows of being spoiled, we're going to talk about Pacific Heights first, and then we'll go into The Plumber, so you've been warned about that. But to talk about Pacific Heights first, which is from John Schlesinger, who is mainly known for doing Midnight Cowboy, but then a lot of his stuff after that was very different from that, and very, very varying in quality. So, to start off, as we talked about in that villain video, what's interesting about this movie, right from the start, is that it introduces a villain that you are absolutely going to hate, and you're going to hate him very quickly. But usually there's a build-up, and this definitely is a thriller with build-up, but it shows you the villain facing consequences for his actions before the movie has even started. Like during the opening credits, we see him having already done what he is ultimately going to do again, and he faces a penalty for it by getting the shit beat out of him. But that is shown to not stop him from continuing. Almost to the point that you might consider he's done this so often, he's used to this at this point. It might even be part of the plan, for all we know. To where it's like, yeah, factor in this will happen, but I'm still going to get what I'm after. Which, of course, is something that you only know in retrospect after having seen the full story. When you just see it the first time you're seeing the movie, the opening scene, it can be quite jarring, especially when you know going in that Keaton is the villain of the movie. It's wild to see a villain face consequences before you even know what he's done, and it's pretty wild. And then we, of course, cut from that to our protagonists, who are Melanie Griffith and Matthew Modine, who have bought this big house and, of course, are lending rooms out. And it seems to be a very sort of mutual endeavor, but it's still something that's kind of weighing down on them, and a lot is riding on this being successful, and finding the right people. And like if this goes south, then that could mean like complete and total financial ruin. But what's great about this is the relationship between them, and the way we see how sort of in sync they are, and how they feel they seem on a very mutual level about where their relationship stands. Not just for the benefit of this whole thing, like when they both decide to put themselves up as single. It feels like it's saying not just about, this is the best way to do this from a financial standpoint, but also them kind of being on the same page about their relationship itself. That's the way I take it anyway. And then the stuff where it's like, they feel so lived in the sense that, but they also kind of feel like they're still in a bit of a honeymoon period. I can't remember if we know for sure how long they've been together, if that's ever said in dialogue, but stuff like the way he's painting the wall in the wrong direction, and she just kind of takes it from him and takes over and does it the right way, and there's like no sort of, you know, skirmish about this. It's just they just so like if one of them does something wrong, the other will pick it up and everything will be perfectly fine. And they act like they've never had a fight in their life, which of course is obviously going to drastically change as this goes on. And the way we see them kind of preparing the house, and how they eventually find their way to the floor, it has a very much a sort of the relationship between Cassavetes and Mia Farrow and Rosemary's Baby comes to mind. Where they're in this new place and they're building their home and everything seems perfectly happy, and of course, I guess you can continue the Rosemary's Baby thing. It's going to be a neighbor, I guess you could say, is going to be what comes into this and turns it into what is essentially a horror show of sorts. And that is, of course, the appearance of this Michael Keaton character, Carter Hayes, who comes in and, you know, he's very smooth, and even stuff that would make another person seem shady right away, like when he's dancing around his credit, he finds a way to make that sound, you know, relatively believable, and how, you know, we're still in, like, this came out in 1990, so it's like, yeah, we're doing the whole wire transfer and stuff like that, and it's like, oh, that might not go, and like, I have it set up a certain way, and it's like, and it all sounds relatively believable. And of course, you know, you can trust Michael Keaton's face, but Michael Keaton also has this great way of making you not trust his face at all. And as far as, like, build-up, because what's really interesting about the way we jump on this character and the story itself is that this facade does not last. Like, this scene alone where he lies about having supposedly met Melanie Griffith already to talk about living here, and then he goes through the whole thing, and then there's even a point where Melanie Griffith says, like, you know, I never met that guy. And it's not, she doesn't even have one brief moment of, oh man, so many people came through here, maybe I just forgot. She immediately knows, no, I didn't meet that guy, and that's fucking shady. And just right away, he's moved himself in without even making anything official. There's still been no money exchange whatsoever. And she just immediately basically has his number and knows that he is no good whatsoever. And Modine comes around pretty quickly as well. And that's the thing is, usually thrillers like this are very slow burn. Like, it's like, take out the opening scene where we see him get the shit beat out of him, and add about 20 to 25 more minutes of them as a couple, and Keaton kind of coming in and out of them having, like, mundane conversations with him and building up the character. You've basically got a Hitchcock movie, but we cut a lot of that out, and we pretty much jump straight into the fact that we know right away that this dude is totally off, which is, of course, in line with the opening scene as well, where hardly anything is hidden about this guy whatsoever. And it does feel like it's almost kind of turning the expectations of this kind of thriller on its head, and this is in that territory we've talked about before about the 90s thriller kind of being its own thing and this own very recognizable formula. And it's like at the very beginning of the decade, in the first year of the decade, it already kind of felt like we were seeing that formula in a different way. That, like, even, you know, movies after would still fall into, oh, let's build up the character, make him look as unthreatening as possible, and then slowly reveal how sinister he is. There's hardly a slow reveal here at all. And I believe at the time it was kind of criticized for that, how it had, like, you know, practically no build-up and stuff like that. But like I said, when you see later thrillers and you see what the formula looks like, it almost kind of feels fresh in a way. That they don't, like, it's like, yeah, you as the audience, you've seen the advertisements, you know what this movie is going in, you know Michael Keaton's the villain. Why build up what, you know, like, why make it not seem like that's what it is? Why not just jump right into it and everybody knows that he's a bad guy right away? And then the build-up comes from the consequences of that, and how he's able to somehow always seemingly have things on his side. And this, like, it almost feels supernatural, the way he can get away with stuff. there are some things in here that feel probably like leaps in logic, and there's stuff like the rules of him, like living there but not having paid any money yet. Seem like a stretch, and that's the kind of thing where, and we're definitely going to get a lot more into this with the plumber, but the idea, and we talked about it with Flight Plan before, where it's like either you're with a movie or you're not. Like either a movie presents itself exactly as it is and says this is what this is, and this is how this world works that we've set up, and how the characters work and how they get away with it, and you're either just say fuck it, I'll run with it, or you're like, that just doesn't add up at all, and you're not with it. But Son of Gods has always been a movie I've been able to kind of carry along with, and I think and this is something else, this is basically the plumber's whole setup, his whole concept, is what I take it as, like, I feel like I'm able to ignore those leaps in logic, because I take it as this sort of very nightmarish scenario, where you're just sort of stuck in this place that, like I said, it's almost like this supernatural force is blocking you from getting out of it, and helps him get away with more and more trapped with him as it goes. There's even a dream sequence in the middle of the movie that does feel very on the nose, but it also kind of feels like this sort of personification of the dread that Keaton causes. And like what it really shows, like, to the audience physically what he's doing to them psychologically, and just taking that approach where it's almost like there's this force, like not even just a dude, like a force that they can't get rid of, and this thing that is just looming over their whole future in general, and then ultimately could be deadly as well. And the way they kind of build him up, where it's like, how we already know that he's shady, and we already know that he's doing something very deconstructive that we can't quite see for a while. We just hear all the tools, and the fact that he's locked himself in by changing the locks. Another thing you'd think he probably wouldn't get away with, but like I said, the way everything lines up in his favor, which almost kind of seems like it could be a sort of allegory on where the character's coming from to begin with, because he comes from a rich family and is probably, up until they shunned him, probably did just everything just went the way he expected it to, which is how he ultimately became the person that he did, and now basically ruins lives to become financially successful, and that's where he's found his way in life, apparently. Yeah, because the mystery surrounding the character also is very interesting, because it is like the entire second half of the movie is basically finding out who he is and where he came from. But that also feels earned in the sense that the entire first half of the movie is so vague and mysterious about his character on purpose. And so we get stuff like when she goes down to the garage and he's just sitting in the dark in his car, just sort of watching her. We kind of feel like these sort of classic horror elements to it. And then there's the moment when he's just sitting in the dark in this apartment, where everything is like getting deconstructed and the roaches are around, and he's got the TV on, and the TV is just white noise, like actual white noise, not the movie that he's in, but that would be significantly worse than white noise itself. Yeah, and then like we were saying, how everything seems to go his way, particularly in the scene when he's going to provoke Drake, the Modine character, into physically harming him. Like, he's going to push him that far until it finally happens. And he calls the cops beforehand, before the provocation even happens. And what's really interesting about this is when we go back to the opening scene, and we see the outcome that has happened. And it's like we were saying, is that just part of the plan, or is it not? What's interesting about this also is it's either that or he's learning as he goes. And it's like if he makes a mistake that gets him caught in a certain way or gets him, beat up in a certain way, last time he's going to not make that mistake this time and will get better at this as he goes. So either way, either everything is exactly in control and exactly the way it's supposed to be, or he's learning as he goes and getting better, and both of those feel equally dangerous. Which is great. It makes the character that more terrifying, especially when you just feel completely in his control, and like he's already pre-thought everything that's going to go down. Which adds a whole satisfaction to the fact that there's like typically in movies like The Plumber, for instance, the sort of revenge where it's like they kind of fight back is generally at like the last minute. Literally in the Plumber, the comeuppance for the Plumber is literally the last 60 seconds before the credits roll. Um, but Pacific Heights devotes an entire portion of the movie, an entire fraction of the movie to that, and does this whole idea of Melanie Griffith going, finding out where he is, and talking to Beverly D'Angelo, and finding out where he is and who he is, and then using everything against him in this way. And it's like the entire second half of the movie is the opposite of what the first half was in regards to who's the one that's in control and who's the one that has the power in this whole scenario, and the one that's going to come up on the wrong side of it. Which is very satisfying. Like I said, the whole idea of taking this formula that we know and shaking it up in this way, where we see things a lot earlier than we think we're going to, and things start developing and going a different path much earlier than we expect, and kind of seeing that seeing Keaton be the one that's in the panic for as long as we do, until we do eventually get to the climax that is more expected and is very 90s thriller. But still pretty terrifying. And this whole thing of how he can always somehow find a way to just sort of reemerge like a ghost, and just find that control over again, even when he's totally and completely off the rails at this point, and the deepest, darkest parts of his personality are now coming through as he becomes potentially murderous. And I love that there's even something intrusive here that's not in the movie's story, but it's like when you know what you know, where when she tracks him down and realizes that he's already moved on to his next target, that being this older woman who eventually he's going to marry and hopefully inherit everything from, is played by Tippi Hedren, who is the real life mother of Melanie Griffith. So it's like, as far as like the character intruding on the other characters, is obviously this big intrusion, but then the whole idea of it being the real life mother of Griffith is like, there's like a whole other level of intrusion that this character does that's really great, and sort of that thing that's sort of outside of the plot. That's just like a bonus bit of greatness. So yeah, so I think that's pretty much what Pacific. Like I said, you really got to kind of choose to run with it if you're going to. But if not, it is something you can probably poke holes in all day. But like I said, I've always chosen to go along with it, and like I said, the way it draws you in with this character, and just how trapped he makes you feel, despite how easy all of this should seem. It's basically like being trapped in a nightmare with him, which, like I said, we do see a manifestation of in the movie, but also just in just this general feel of dread that he brings with him that you can feel throughout the movie. Is as he just literally takes their lives as far as like identity and all that other stuff, which is what he does. Yeah, so that's a movie I've always taken to, but it is also like, it's quintessential 90s thriller without necessarily fully using, like, the formula's there, but they do a lot of different things with it that kind of stray away from it as much as they can. Ultimately, even though we come back to that, like I said, if you're like me and one of your great guilty pleasures is the 90s thriller in general, that's kind of like, if you didn't get that climax, you would feel underwhelmed. You would feel like you were missing something. Like, it didn't quite reach the point it was supposed to. But yeah, so even if it becomes predictable, that's still the joy of movies like this in general. If, like I said, you're a fan of that formula, but also seeing that formula toyed with just a little bit. So now I want to go into The Plumber, which should be relatively brief because The Plumber itself is relatively brief. It's like 75 minutes. It is so incredibly short. Like about between an hour 15 and an hour 20. It's less than an hour 20, for sure. And once again, this one especially is one where you just have to make the choice that you're going to run with it. Because it sets up this whole thing. It actually kind of seems like it sets it up a bit already in this moment at the beginning where we're dealing with this couple, this very, scholarly like couple, and the woman is talking about having just been on this trip for study purposes, and a sorcerer came into the tent, and she talks about how like they had to be perfectly still, or like the movement would upset him, and this went on for like hours, and it's like she felt trapped in this really seemingly supernatural way by this guy, and there was nothing she could do about it. It was like being in a dream state, and you're just unable to do anything about it. Like those nightmares that you have where it's clear what's going on, but you're just like frozen in place, and all you can do is like spectate. That's basically the concept of the movie in general. There's a lot of allegory stuff going on here with stuff like classism and stuff like that. But I just kind of take it, like, I find it sort of more impactful to take it as just this nightmare scenario thriller that it sets itself, which it also embraces wholeheartedly, just as much as it does a more allegorical side. Yeah, like I was saying, it was a TV movie in Australia in '79, and then in 1981 it made its way to like U.S. theaters. But still, I feel like nobody knows what it is. I didn't know what it was until I was me and a friend were discussing Peter Weir's filmography, and she was like raving about it, and it was like I didn't even know, and I felt pretty aware of Weir's filmography, and somehow I didn't know this movie existed until that conversation. So unless I had heard it was a TV movie and just dismissed it. But yeah, this is like I said, it's a ride if you're willing to go with it. And I think something that also comes from this, because the concept being very simple, a plumber shows up on their doorstep more often than not while the husband is away, and says, oh yeah, I'm here from the college, I'm the plumber from the college, and I'm here because, your pipes need worked on, there's hair in them, so I'm just going to go in there real quick and fix the problem. And then naturally these problems start to balloon, and it's like, oh, now it's this, and now it's this, until eventually the plumber's just coming and going as he pleases, and the bathroom is becoming more and more destructive, much like Carter Hayes' room. And this woman just feels trapped in place, and like there's just nothing she can do about it. And it's like she hears these moments where like he'll start singing and the water's running, and it's like, is he showering? And it's like, that would seem like this sort of almost mundane thing, like this, like the root of this thriller begins with, is the plumber taking a shower in the shower when he should be working? But the thing is it's like that whole intrusive nature of it, especially like we talk about, like home invasion in general, and the fact that Carter Hayes is like, the neighbor and the tenant from hell, and it's like this, like when you think about the worst possible scenario of going into this kind of thing, he is the embodiment of that. But the plumber's intrusion is even more specific, because it's the bathroom specifically that is being gone into, and he just stays in there for these long, long stretches of time, and when he comes out, it's worse than the way it was when he went in there. And this just continuously happens at this impossible rate. And it's like, the fact that you think about all the houses, all the rooms in your house, which one you're likely to be most vulnerable in. The bathroom is probably at the top of that list, and the fact that that's the room that's being violated feels very much like a violation of your person in a way. And so I feel like there's really something to that specifically. And the way, like, what's accepted and what's unaccepted, and how that line can kind of blur, where it's like there's one particular scene that's a dinner scene, where they have these very important people over, and of course naturally somebody is going to have to use the bathroom, and the bathroom at this point is just all the pipes having protruded, and that's just all the room is. It's just the pipes, basically. All the walls are torn down, and it's all like, it looks like an abandoned room in a warehouse or something. And it's like, oh, by the way, the toilet and shower are like behind the maze. And it's like the way the characters don't accept it, but yet still somehow kind of just run with it anyway. Like I said, basically the way you have to treat the movie. How it's like there's just no way any of this is plausible, but it's like but I'm just like running, like it's like it hypnotizes you. It's that whole thing of being stuck in the tent with the sorcerer and not being able to make your own move or otherwise perturb the threat. You just have to watch everything happen and be a prisoner in your own living space, um, and having no access to the most vulnerable room in the house. And it's that in itself is so like watching it, like describing it and watching it are two different things, which is why I anticipated I'd have trouble with this. But yeah, that sort of setup in general is so terrifying, and the fact that that is the case also, where like just the general idea of when you have a problem, typically when it's going to be fixed, somebody that you don't know is going to come into your house, and how that's never a 100% comfortable scenario, no matter how personable you are. It always feels like there's some sort of intrusion or some sort of violation happening. And this is just like the total personification of that in this really over the top way, to the point that it's like it feels partially comedy as well, and I'm pretty sure that's on purpose. And it's like it has such this surreal sort of sense of humor to it, but also the terror of it also feels very surreal as well. There's one particular scene that might be one of my favorite scenes in any thriller, where he spontaneously comes up with a song and writes it on the shower wall and then sings it and performs it in its entirety. He has a guitar and a harmonica going at the same time and performs this song he just made up on the spot, seemingly just to antagonize her. And it's one of the wildest things I've ever seen. And it's yeah, and when you're able to just embrace stuff like that and not sort of see a movie that you can poke holes into and be like, why isn't the character doing this or doing that? When you just take in, it's basically a trance-like movie in itself. It takes you to some really wild places. And like I said, you'll be wholly frustrated in the way you're supposed to be, and you'll be like darkly amused in the way that you're also supposed to be. And it's a crazy ass experience. Like when it finally ends, like so quickly. Like I said, finally it ends so quickly. It's only like an hour and 15 minutes, and the ending is so incredibly abrupt. Like I said, the whole comeuppance of the plumber happens in like the last 30 to 60 seconds, and then the credits just immediately start rolling. Uh, it's, and it's crazy. There's like hardly any build up to it either. It just happens, just as quickly and as surreal as this whole scenario started. And it's fucking crazy. And there's also moments even where she goes outside of the apartment and it still feels like she's trapped because he'll still just materialize. Like when she goes to the calls to see if he even has a job there, the response is he materializes behind her, and the teacher she's talking to is friendly with him. And it's like this nightmare scenario that you can't get away from. And there's this especially creepy moment when the teacher's here and then she flees down another hallway and around a corner, and he's stopped in the middle of the hallway and he's like deciding if he's gonna go after her or not. And then he does. And it's like this whole thing of, even after the whole setup of how trapped she feels in her own home, she can't even leave now without that feeling following her. And it's genuinely scary. It's crazy. Like the movie really gets under your skin, yet somehow has a really sick sense of humor about itself too, which is crazy. And I guess another thing that you can say is part of the allegory, but I feel like it also helps with alienating the plumber from like normal people. Because we already talked about like the classes and thing, but also the whole thing about like there being a fine line between when people are like sophisticated, like the scholarly people, and then you're the other side of that, like the plumber, where you clearly come from a totally different place and have a totally different outlook, not just on life and how the world works, but like what's appropriate and what isn't, which is clearly at play here, even though it's also clear that this is a lot of intentional antagonism. He's also very like politically themed, but it's like, as far as like his whole outlooks, it feels very like a product of like the late '60s or something. So it feels like just in general, he's from like a different place entirely, and comes from like a totally different sort of other world or something. And it's yeah, it's crazy. So that's how I feel about that. So as far as like wanting a movie that's ultimately one of those '90s thrillers that we love so much, versus a movie that just gives you a totally and completely surreal experience, I would say from an objective standpoint, um, the Plumber probably accomplishes a lot more of what it was going for, and perfects its execution on this seemingly impossible concept. Whereas Pacific Heights is easier to like poke holes in and stuff like that. And I've obviously seen Pacific Heights a lot more. I probably will see Pacific Heights more. It's a movie that I just kind of come back to every now and then anyway. And I think the Keaton performance probably has a lot to do with that. Um, but I mean, if you want like a really specific experience of terror, the Plumber is definitely going to give you that if you can find it. So that's the main problem the Plumber has as far as just being seen in general. But yeah, so like I said, Pacific Heights is the movie that I come back to more. So in a sense, I guess I prefer that one. But like I said, as far as like a more sort of visceral experience and something that's gonna really take you on this ride, I would recommend the Plumber more probably. But that's pretty much where I stand with these, I think. So I think next we're going to go into probably the new releases and then the Six Tremors movie. The order on that may vary, but that's I think what the plan is. So and then we'll go on from there to all the other stuff. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.